Sign in. The 1% Gone Bad, Part 1. Open in app. Listen via. The 1% Gone Bad, Part 1. The Secession of the 1%. MXTM aka Pirate 1 a VJ Sunu MIX. April 10, 2026. Yes, this is the hard antithesis, not corruption by softness, but capture by force. Not transition, secession of the powerful. Gear hash. A post-scarcity secession doctrine. By Pirate First for MXDM's newsletter. Introduction, the exit of the powerful. Artificial intelligence does not only equalize intelligence. It also accelerates escape. The first to understand this are not citizens. They are militaries, autocracies, technates, private sovereigns. The moment intelligence becomes universal, governance becomes unstable. The response of the powerful is not reform. It is withdrawal. The 1% is no longer a bridge. It becomes a compound. Not a campus, a perimeter. Not a dream catcher, a targeting system. Not a transition, a separation. The doctrine mutates. Instead of absorbing displacement, it abandons the displaced. Instead of equalization, it locks advantage. Instead of universal intelligence, it weaponizes augmentation. The elite does not lead society into post-scarcity. It leaves society behind. Military-grade charter cities. Autonomous fortified enclaves. AI-governed technate zones. Longevity-enhanced ruling strata. Robot armies replacing population legitimacy. The 1% becomes the lifeboat of the powerful. Inside, augmented cognition, extended lifespan, automated defense, closed economies, synthetic food, robotic industry. Outside, obsolete labor, unmanaged populations, resource deserts, political fragmentation, cognitive unemployment. This is not dystopia by collapse. It is dystopia by successful exit. The future splits. Not rich vs poor. Not nations versus nations. But protected intelligence vs abandoned humanity. The 1% survives. The 99 become terrain. Table of Contents. Prologue. Part 1, The Great Secession. Intelligence equalization as elite panic. When governance becomes liability. The exit strategy of power. From nations to compounds. The abandoned majority. Part 2, Military post-scarcity enclaves. The fortress model. AI-directed defense perimeters. Autonomous kill chain governance. Robotics instead of population. Sovereignty without citizens. Influence echoes from structures like the People's Liberation Army, the security logic of North Korea, and hardened regime preservation strategies. Part 3, Technocratic charter strongholds. Corporate sovereignty zones. Algorithmic citizenship. Entry by cognitive value. Exit denied. The closed innovation state. Private sector visions orbit ideas associated with Elon Musk-style technate autonomy. Part 4, The cyborg superclass. Longevity lock-in. Neural augmentation monopoly. Intelligence stratification. The immortal boardroom. Biological class divide. Part 5, The subdued periphery. Population without leverage. Automation without welfare. Surveillance without services. Managed instability zones. The geography of abandonment. Parallels emerge with power consolidation logic seen in the Iran theocracy or Taliban-era Afghanistan governance, control inward, disengagement outward. Part 6, The new feudal architecture. Compounds as city-states. Robot armies as population replacement. AI diplomacy between enclaves. Resource corridors without nations. The return of fortress civilization. Part 7, The locked future. No path to entry. Intelligence without mobility. The permanent perimeter. The end of social climbing. The frozen hierarchy. Part 8, the final split. Humanity as outside. The 1% as species fork. Post-scarcity without society. Sovereignty without solidarity. The 1% as lifeboat civilization. This creates a brutal triad. The 1% transition architecture. The 1% gone bad secession architecture. Implicit third, collapse if neither wins. The 1% becomes doctrine, becomes a warning. Either the 1% absorbs humanity or the 1% abandons humanity. One builds campuses. The other builds compounds. Prologue, the secession of the 1%. We are entering the first era in human history where intelligence is no longer scarce. Artificial intelligence dissolves the monopoly once held by institutions, experts, and managerial classes. Planning, designing, forecasting, negotiating, capabilities once restricted to a narrow elite, begin to diffuse across the population. The cognitive ladder compresses. Authority weakens. Legitimacy fragments. This moment does not only empower the many. It also destabilizes the few. For centuries, elites governed through asymmetry, superior information, superior coordination, superior prediction. When intelligence equalizes, governance becomes harder, not easier. A population that can reason, simulate, and organize at scale becomes unpredictable. Consensus slows. Compliance weakens. Control becomes expensive. The response is not necessarily repression. The response is secession. The 1%, originally conceived as a transition infrastructure, mutates into an exit strategy. Instead of absorbing displacement, it isolates stability. Instead of integrating society, it withdraws from it. The future is no longer built with the many, but secured for the few. Campuses become compounds. Participation becomes clearance. Governance becomes perimeter management. The new 1% is not symbolic. It is physical, fortified, and autonomous. Self-sufficient enclaves emerge: AI-directed logistics, robotic industry, synthetic food production, closed-loop water systems, automated defense, and algorithmic governance. Population legitimacy is replaced by technological sovereignty. Labor is no longer required. Consent is no longer necessary. The elite no longer need society to function. They only need it to remain outside. A new class begins to form, not merely wealthy, but biologically and cognitively differentiated. Longevity therapies extend their time horizon. Neural augmentation expands their decision bandwidth. Continuous AI mediation amplifies coordination. Governance compresses into a small, persistent, technologically reinforced ruling layer. They do not rule the world. They outlive it. Beyond the perimeter, the majority enters a different trajectory. Automation removes bargaining power faster than new structures appear. Institutions fragment. Regions compete for diminishing leverage. Populations remain connected digitally but excluded materially. Intelligence becomes universal, but sovereignty does not. The result is not global dictatorship. It is global separation. Fortified charter zones. Corporate sovereign districts. Military technates. Autocratic continuity states. Privately governed infrastructure corridors. Each iteration refines the same logic: stability inside, volatility outside. The 1% becomes a lifeboat civilization, not floating above collapse, but structurally detached from it. Its goal is not domination. Its goal is insulation. Not empire, but endurance. This is the hard failure mode of post-scarcity transition. Not oppression of the many, but abandonment of them. The hierarchy does not survive by controlling society. It survives by leaving society behind. The fire still spreads. But instead of building bridges across it, the 1% builds walls within it. And once the perimeter closes, there is no transition left, only distance. Part 1, The Great Secession. 1. intelligence equalization as elite panic. For 10,000 years, the most durable form of power was not land. Not armies. Not gold. It was the monopoly on knowing what others did not. The priest who read the sky. The merchant who read the market. The general who read the terrain before the enemy did. The bureaucrat who understood the code before the citizen could file. Intelligence, the ability to model, predict, synthesize, and decide, was rationed by design. Not always consciously. Not always maliciously. But structurally, inevitably, and with self-reinforcing momentum. Every institution that survived long enough understood the same principle. Knowledge hoarded is power preserved. Universities selected for it. Corporations salaried it. Governments credentialed it. Armies ranked by it. The asymmetry was the architecture. The gap was the system. And then the gap began to close. It did not close all at once. Revolutions rarely announced themselves cleanly. First it was search, the externalization of recall. Then navigation, the externalization of spatial reasoning. Then translation, the dissolution of linguistic frontiers. Then recommendation, the outsourcing of preference modeling. Each wave was absorbed. Managed. Moneized. The elite adapted. New credentials replaced old ones. New moats were dug around new competencies. The equilibrium held. Until it didn't. The rupture arrived not with a single tool but with a capability threshold, the moment artificial intelligence could not merely retrieve or sort, but reason. Not simulate reasoning for narrow tasks. Not pattern match within closed domains. Reason. Synthesize across disciplines. Generate strategy. Model consequence chains. Draft policy. Anticipate negotiation positions. Construct financial instruments. Argue legal cases. Design infrastructure. Compose research proposals. Manage supply chains in real time. Every function that had required a decade of specialized formation, compressible into a prompt. Every competency that had justified an institution, distributable across a network. Every asymmetry that had anchored power, suddenly porous. The ladder did not break. It dissolved. And this is where elite panic begins. Not with fear of poverty. Not with fear of irrelevance in the abstract. With something more precise, more visceral, more existential. The fear of losing the thing that justified the distance. The 1% did not merely accumulate resources. It accumulated legitimacy through demonstrated cognitive superiority. The CEO who saw what others missed. The investor who modeled what others couldn't. The technocrat who understood what the public couldn't process. The strategist who anticipated what enemies couldn't imagine. This was the story they told themselves. And it was partially true. Which made the threat more unbearable. Because when the tools that enabled that superiority become universal, the story collapses. Not the wealth. Not the position. Not the compound. But the story. The internal narrative. The justification for the distance. And a ruling class without a coherent self-justification is a ruling class in existential crisis. Panic does not always look like panic. In calm rooms, in boardrooms above the 40th floor, in defense councils and sovereign wealth fund strategy sessions, elite panic looks like prudence. Like long-horizon thinking. Like fiduciary responsibility. It generates reports. It commissions scenarios. It funds think tanks. It sponsors governance summits. But underneath the language of stewardship, the calculus has already shifted. The question is no longer, how do we govern a more capable population? The question is now, how do we remain ungovernable by one? That single inversion, from management of others to insulation from others, is where the transition doctrine dies and the secession doctrine is born. Historically, elites faced with destabilization chose one of three responses. Suppression, deny the capability to the many. Burn the library. Control the press. License the algorithm. Limit access. Enforce dependency. Absorption, co-opt the capable before they organize. Scholarship programs. Meritocratic credentialing. Bring the best of the outside in. Domesticate the threat. Give the ambitious a stake in the existing hierarchy. Exit, withdraw before the capable majority can leverage its new power. Not fight. Not integrate. Disappear into protected space. Render distance structural. The first response is increasingly unavailable. Intelligence diffusion through networked infrastructure cannot be fully suppressed without destroying the infrastructure the elite also depends on. The second response buys time, but accelerates the underlying dynamic. Each absorbed talent strengthens the meritocratic argument, and the next wave demands the same accommodation. The third response, exit, requires something the others do not. It requires having built, already, somewhere to go. This is the function the 1% originally served. Not as a dystopian project. As a hedge. Charter cities were sold as urban innovation laboratories. Autonomous zones as regulatory sandboxes. Private governance experiments as efficiency models. Longevity research as humanitarian medicine. AI-directed security as smart policing. Each piece appeared, in isolation, defensible. Reasonable. Incremental. Even progressive. But viewed architecturally, as a system, not a set of experiments, a pattern emerges. Every piece builds toward the same capability, a self-sufficient enclave that requires no external population to function. Automated food. Automated logistics. Automated defense. Automated governance. Closed monetary systems. Closed legal systems. Closed reproductive and medical systems. Not a city that serves a population. A city that has made a population optional. Intelligence equalization did not create elite panic by threatening elite survival. It created elite panic by threatening elite necessity. A ruling class that is needed is a ruling class that negotiates. A ruling class that is no longer needed has no reason to negotiate. And a ruling class with the technology to make itself self-sufficient, with the logistics, the defense, the cognition, the biology, does not negotiate. It exits. What the equalization event actually triggers is not a war between classes. It is a race. Can the many organize their new intelligence into collective power before the few complete their infrastructural exit? The outcome of that race is not determined by ideology. It is determined by lead time. The enclaves needed decades to build. The cognitive tools needed months to distribute. The timeline mismatch is the trap. By the time the majority understands what the intelligence tools have made possible, the walls are already standing. By the time movements form around new collective capabilities, the compounds are already stocked. By the time demands are made, there is no longer anyone inside the perimeter who is required to respond. Elite panic is not irrational. That is the hardest thing to hold. The panic is a correct reading of a real dynamic that intelligence equalization does, structurally, dissolve the foundations of the old hierarchy. The irrational part, the catastrophic part, is the response. Not adaptation. Not stewardship. Not the construction of new legitimacy adequate to a more capable world. But flight. Organized, funded, technically sophisticated, architecturally deliberate flight, dressed in the language of innovation and executed with the precision of a military withdrawal. The elite reads the future correctly. And builds the wrong door. This is where the doctrine of the 1%, as transition architecture, first fractures. Not in the ambition. Not in the technology. Not even in the will. In the fear. The fear that says, if intelligence is no longer scarce, then our position is no longer justified. And if our position is no longer justified, we will not wait to be displaced. We will leave before the argument concludes. That decision, made quietly, in stages, with impeccable infrastructure, is the founding act of secession. Everything that follows is just construction. The compound does not begin as a wall. It begins as a hedge, but hedges, tended long enough, become walls, and walls, fortified long enough, become borders, and borders, defended long enough, become nations, and nations that no longer need their neighbors stop calling them neighbors, they start calling them outside. 2. When governance becomes liability. There is a moment in the life of every powerful institution when it stops asking, "How do we serve the governed?" and begins asking, "How do we survive the governing?" That moment is not announced. It does not arrive as a confession. It arrives as a budget reallocation, a shifted priority, a quietly amended mandate, a meeting that produces no public minutes. It arrives, most often, as language. Efficiency, sustainability, streamlined governance. Right-sizing the social contract. The words remain civic. The logic underneath has already turned. Governance, at its structural core, is a bargain. The governed surrender a portion of autonomy, freedom of action, a share of resources, the right to unilateral force, in exchange for a set of guarantees: security, arbitration, infrastructure, social continuity. The bargain holds as long as both sides need each other. The state needs the population, for labor, for legitimacy, for military capacity, for tax revenue, for the social stability that makes long-term planning possible. The population needs the state, for protection, for dispute resolution, for public goods that no individual can provision alone. Need, on both sides, is the adhesive. When the adhesive weakens on one side only, the bargain does not renegotiate. It ruptures. For most of recorded history, the elite needed the population in ways that were structural, unavoidable, and deeply physical. You needed farmers to grow the food. You needed soldiers to hold the border. You needed workers to build the road, the port, the canal, the factory. You needed consumers to buy the output of the system you controlled. You needed a tax base to fund the administration that protected your assets. Population was not sentiment. Population was infrastructure. Even the most autocratic rulers understood this. The pharaoh needed the fellaheen. The emperor needed the legions. The industrial baron needed the labor pool. The democratic state needed the voter, if only to manufacture consent. The need was asymmetric. The powerful needed the many far less than the many needed the powerful, but it was real. It constrained. It obligated. It created, however minimally, a flaw. That flaw is what governance was built upon. And now, systematically, the flaw is being removed. Automation does not merely replace tasks. It severs dependencies. This is the distinction that most economic analyses of automation miss, or prefer not to confront directly. When a machine replaces a human in a factory, the economic conversation focuses on displacement, what new work emerges, how retraining occurs, which sectors absorb the released labor. But beneath that conversation, something structurally different is happening. The owner of the factory no longer needs that human. Not economically. Not operationally. Not politically. The human's leverage, the implicit threat of withdrawal, slowdown, strike, non-cooperation, evaporates. The human's claim on the system, grounded in the contribution of irreplaceable labor, dissolves. And with it, the human's claim on governance. Because governance, at the level where power actually operates, is not primarily about values. It is about leverage. Leverage is what transforms a request into a demand. What converts a grievance into a negotiation. What makes the powerful listen. When leverage disappears, when the many can be replaced, supplemented, or simply ignored without operational consequence, governance does not reform. It becomes optional. Consider the sequence. In the first phase of industrialization, the powerful needed labor so desperately that they were forced, not by goodwill, but by structural dependency, to absorb labor's demands over time. Unions. Minimum wages. Safety regulations. Social insurance. Public education. Universal healthcare in some contexts. Not gifts. Concessions extracted under duress. The welfare state was not built from above by enlightened elites. It was built from below by populations that understood, collectively, that their labor was irreplaceable, and organized around that understanding. The bargain held because need held. Now map the reversal. Robotic logistics replace warehouse labor. Algorithmic trading replaces financial analysis. AI systems replace legal research, medical diagnosis, software development, content creation, customer interaction, supply chain management. Each replacement removes a category of irreplaceability. Each removal weakens a category of leverage. Each weakening loosens a thread of the governance bargain. Individually, each thread seems minor. Structurally, the fabric is unraveling. The elite, operating with longer time horizons, better models, and earlier access to the very tools that enable this analysis, reads this trajectory before the majority does. And the reading produces a specific conclusion. Governance is becoming more expensive at precisely the moment it is becoming less necessary. More expensive because the destabilized, displaced, cognitively empowered population generates demands that scale faster than the capacity to meet them. Unmanaged automation produces political volatility. Volatility requires institutional response. Institutional response requires resources. Resources require redistribution. Redistribution requires consent of the powerful. Less necessary because the operational dependency that once made that redistribution structurally logical is eroding. The calculation shifts. Governance, the management of a population's claims against the system, transitions from an asset to a cost center. And cost centers, in the logic of the powerful, are candidates for elimination. This does not happen as declaration. It happens as drift. Regulatory capture deepens, not through conspiracy, but through the structural advantage of concentrated interests over dispersed populations in legislative processes. Public goods atrophy, not through ideological commitment to austerity alone, but through the rational withdrawal of investment from populations whose political leverage is declining. Tax architecture evolves, not randomly, but consistently in the direction that benefits mobile capital over fixed population. International agreements shift, from frameworks that bind sovereign power to protect populations, toward frameworks that protect investment from sovereign interference. Each move, in isolation, has a technical justification. Viewed in aggregate, over decades, the direction is unmistakable. The architecture of governance is being quietly restructured, from a system designed to manage the claims of populations to a system designed to insulate the assets of the powerful from those claims. The state does not disappear. It is repurposed. At a certain threshold, the repurposed state reveals its new function not in policy but in infrastructure investment. Compare what gets built. In an era when governance serves population, roads, schools, hospitals, water systems, public housing, transit networks, libraries, labor courts, environmental protections. Infrastructure that delivers capacity to the many. In an era when governance serves insulation, surveillance architecture, border management, private security integration, data enclosure, IP enforcement, tax havens, extradition shields, private arbitration frameworks, satellite-based communication systems outside national infrastructure. Infrastructure that protects assets from the many. The shift in what gets built tells you everything about who governance now serves. And when even that repurposed state begins to feel like friction, when even the insulating function of the state is too slow, too messy, too subject to democratic reversal, the next logic follows naturally. Why govern through states at all? This is the question that charter city advocates, seaside startup nations, private governance theorists, and sovereign zone architects are really answering. Not, how do we design better cities? But, how do we design governance structures that cannot be democratically reversed? The vocabulary is innovation. The ambition is immunization. Immunization against electoral cycles. Against redistributive majorities. Against the claims of populations whose leverage has been structurally eliminated but who have not yet accepted that elimination. Because populations, unlike markets, do not price in their own obsolescence automatically. They resist. They organize. They demand. They vote. They riot. And as long as any of those actions can alter the outcome, governance remains a liability. There is a concept in financial engineering called tail risk, the small probability event whose consequences, if it occurs, are catastrophic enough to justify enormous expenditure in prevention. The powerful do not fear average governance. They fear the tail. The tail is a population, newly equipped with distributed intelligence tools, sufficiently organized, sufficiently radicalized by displacement, that achieves the political momentum to restructure the underlying system. Not merely elect a reformist government. Restructure the system. Wealth taxes with enforcement architecture. Automation levies redistributed universally. Corporate governance reforms that give labor structural power. Intellectual property regimes redesigned around public benefit. International coordination against capital mobility. The tail is not a revolution in the 19th century sense. It does not require barricades. It requires sufficient political coherence among a sufficient majority, operating with sufficient analytical capability, sustained over sufficient time. And for the first time in history, the tools that make that coherence possible are widely distributed. The tail risk, from the perspective of the enclave building class, has never been higher. And the rational response to elevated tail risk is not to reform the system that generates it. It is to exit the system entirely. Governance becomes liability at the precise moment when the cost of managing population claims exceeds the operational value of the population generating them. When that crossover occurs, and the models of the powerful suggest it is not a distant abstraction but an approaching operational reality, the logic of the social contract inverts. The contract was, I need you, therefore I accommodate you. The inversion is, I no longer need you, therefore I no longer accommodate you. The inversion does not require malice. It does not require a meeting where powerful men decide to abandon humanity. It requires only that the powerful follow the same rational calculus they have always followed, in a world where the inputs to that calculus have quietly, structurally, irreversibly changed. And here is what makes this chapter of the secession doctrine so difficult to interrupt. The governed do not feel the shift all at once. They feel it as a series of disappointments. The reform that almost passed. The program that was cut. The institution that stopped answering. The party that won and changed nothing. The demand that was heard and not met. The leverage that was applied and did not hold. Each disappointment is processed individually. Each failure blamed on specific actors, specific betrayals, specific failures of will or courage or integrity. But the failures are not individual. They are systemic. The system is no longer designed to respond. Because the system no longer needs to. By the time this is understood clearly enough to generate a response adequate to its scale, the enclaves are built. The perimeters are closed. The exit is complete. Governance does not become a liability overnight. It becomes a liability the way a relationship deteriorates, through the slow accumulation of unmet obligations, through the quiet arithmetic of diminishing need, through the moment one party realizes it has already made all the arrangements for leaving. And the only thing remaining is to close the door. The most dangerous thing about a door that closes quietly is that the people still inside think it is merely resting. They do not understand it has been latched until they reach for the handle and find there is no handle on their side. 3. The exit strategy of power. Power does not announce its departures. It does not hold press conferences to explain that it is withdrawing from the social contract. It does not publish manifestos declaring that the governed have become ungovernable and the governing have decided to stop. Power leaves the way a tide leaves, gradually, then completely, and by the time the shoreline is exposed and the absence is undeniable, the water is already somewhere else entirely, reorganized, distant, indifferent to what it left behind. The exit strategy of power is not a strategy in the military sense. It is not a plan with a start date and a final objective. It is an architecture. Built incrementally. Funded through ordinary capital flows. Justified through ordinary innovation language. Assembled across decades so that no single piece, at any single moment, looks like what the whole thing is. Only when the last piece locks into place does the shape become visible. And by then, the shape is a perimeter. And the perimeter is closed. To understand the exit strategy, you must first understand that the powerful do not think in election cycles. This is the foundational asymmetry that most political analysis fails to account for. Democratic systems are engineered around 4-year horizons. Sometimes 8. Occasionally 12, in the most stable parliamentary variants. The logic of democratic governance is inherently short: win the election, deliver sufficient satisfaction to retain power, manage the crises that arrive within the term, survive to the next cycle. The logic of accumulated capital is inherently long. A sovereign wealth fund models across 50-year horizons. A dynastic family office plans across generations. A vertically integrated technology company building physical infrastructure thinks in infrastructure time, 30, 40, 60 years to full return on investment. A longevity-oriented ruling class, operating with biological time horizons that democratic populations cannot match, plans in spans that democratic institutions cannot even legislate within. The exit strategy was not conceived last decade. The groundwork was laid when the first charter city legislation was drafted. When the first private arbitration framework superseded national courts. When the first special economic zone was carved from sovereign territory and handed to private governance under the name of development. The powerful did not suddenly decide to exit. They have been building the door for 40 years. Every exit strategy requires the same 5 elements. A destination. A route. Resources for the journey. The ability to close the route behind you. And enough time before the departure is understood to make pursuit impossible. The destination is the enclave, the self-sufficient, fortified, autonomous zone that requires no external population to function. The route is the architecture of legal, financial, and physical infrastructure built across decades: special economic zones, private governance frameworks, offshore financial systems, satellite communications, autonomous logistics chains, private security arrangements, that allows a gradual transfer of essential operations from public to private, from national to sovereign, from accountable to insulated. The resources are the capital accumulated during the era of maximum dependency, the era when the powerful still needed the population and extracted wealth from that interdependency, now being redeployed into the infrastructure of separation. The ability to close the route is regulatory capture, intellectual property enclosure, and the systematic defunding of the public institutions that might otherwise maintain pursuit capacity: tax enforcement, antitrust, international financial regulation, democratic legitimacy mechanisms. And the most critical element, is the gap between when the powerful understand what is happening and when the majority does. That gap is the operational window. Everything essential happens inside it. The exit strategy of power has historical precedent, but the scale and the technology make this iteration categorically different. The Roman senatorial class, in the late Empire, withdrew investment from the civic infrastructure of Rome itself, its water systems, its grain dole, its legions, and retreated into fortified country estates, private armies, and local clientage networks. The empire did not fall because barbarians were stronger. It fell because the class with the resources to maintain it decided maintenance was no longer in their interest. The medieval church built a parallel jurisdiction, canon law, ecclesiastical courts, separate taxation, that operated within and alongside secular authority while remaining fundamentally insulated from it. When secular power threatened church assets, the church had an institutional infrastructure sophisticated enough to resist, negotiate, or simply outlast it. The British East India Company did not merely trade. It governed. It maintained armies, adjudicated disputes, minted currency, and administered territory, corporate sovereignty that preceded and in many ways exceeded the formal empire that eventually absorbed it. Each of these was a version of the same maneuver, the construction of an alternative institutional architecture that provides the functions of governance to those inside it while rendering the existing governance structure progressively irrelevant. The difference now is threefold. First, the technology makes genuine self-sufficiency achievable in ways it never was before. The East India Company still needed local labor, local supply chains, local knowledge. The modern enclave is engineering its way out of each of those dependencies, one automated system at a time. Second, the speed of capital mobility means the transfer of resources from the old system to the new one can happen faster than any political response can organize. Third, and most consequentially, intelligence amplification means the enclave class can now outplan, outmodel, and outmaneuver democratic governance not merely through resource advantage, but through cognitive advantage. They see further. They move first. They adapt faster. The asymmetry is no longer just wealth. It is temporal. The exit strategy operates across 4 simultaneous tracks. Not sequentially, simultaneously. Each track reinforces the others. Each track, pursued alone, looks unremarkable. Together, they constitute withdrawal. The financial track. Capital that once required geographic anchoring, factories, mines, land, becomes progressively untethered. Offshore holding structures, transfer pricing, patent box arrangements, treaty shopping, the systematic exploitation of the gap between where value is created and where it is taxed. Not evasion in the crude sense. Architecture. Legal, internationally coordinated, politically protected architecture that severs the connection between the generation of wealth and the obligation to the population that generated the conditions for it. The result, an accumulating pool of stateless capital, enormous, mobile, and increasingly deployed not into productive investment in existing economies but into the infrastructure of exit. The territorial track. Parallel to the financial architecture, a physical architecture takes shape. Special economic zones in which normal labor law does not apply. Charter city proposals that carve governance enclaves from host nation territory. Private island jurisdictions. Floating city prototypes. Autonomous maritime platforms. Suborbital and eventually orbital infrastructure designed from the beginning to exist outside any nation-state's regulatory reach. Each territorial experiment is framed as innovation. Each one is actually a prototype for sovereign separation. The question being tested in each case is the same: how small can the governed population be before governance becomes fully controllable by those who fund it? The answer the experiments keep converging on: very small. Small enough to select. Small enough to expel. Small enough to render unanimous by construction. The legal track. The third track is the least visible and the most consequential. It is the systematic replacement of public law with private law. Mandatory arbitration clauses that remove disputes from public courts. Investment treaties that allow corporations to sue sovereign governments for regulatory changes that affect their profits. Intellectual property regimes that convert knowledge, once a public good, into a privately owned, internationally enforced asset class. Platform terms of service that constitute, for the billions operating within them, the effective law of their digital lives. Each of these is a jurisdiction. Not a metaphorical jurisdiction. A real system of rules, enforcement mechanisms, and binding outcomes that operates alongside, and increasingly supersedes, the public legal systems that populations nominally control through democratic processes. The private legal system does not replace the public one suddenly. It grows beside it, handles more and more of what actually matters, and eventually reaches the point where the public system is the residual, handling what the private system has not yet bothered to absorb. The cognitive track. The fourth track is the newest, and the one that transforms the exit strategy from historical pattern into something without precedent. The enclave class does not merely accumulate capital, territory, and legal insulation. It accumulates cognitive advantage, and then converts that advantage into infrastructure. AI systems that model regulatory environments faster than regulators can update them. predictive political intelligence that anticipates democratic outcomes and prepositions assets before they can be effected. Algorithmic governance systems that remove human decision-making and human accountability from the management of critical enclave functions. Longevity and augmentation technologies that extend the time horizon of the enclave class beyond the biological limits that constrain democratic majorities. The cognitive track is not merely about being smarter. It is about being faster. In any contest between concentrated, AI-amplified decision-making and distributed, democratically constrained decision-making, speed is decisive. The enclave class makes a decision, implements it, and adapts before the democratic process has finished debating whether to respond. By the time the response is formulated, the situation has changed. By the time the law is written, the capital has moved. By the time the regulation is enforced, the operation is in a different jurisdiction. The cognitive track does not win by being right. It wins by being faster than accountability. What makes the exit strategy so difficult to interrupt is that it does not require coordination in the conspiratorial sense. There is no council of the powerful meeting in secret to ratify the plan. There is instead something more dangerous, convergent rational behavior among actors who share the same structural position, operate with the same quality of information, and face the same incentive landscape. They reach the same conclusions independently. They build compatible infrastructure separately. They move in the same direction without instruction because the direction is simply where rational self-interest points when you can see far enough ahead. This is what makes it uninterruptible through the exposure of conspiracy. There is no conspiracy to expose. There is only a class acting rationally in a world where rationality, for those with sufficient resources and sufficient foresight, points toward exit. The exit strategy has a tempo. It does not accelerate uniformly. It has phases, each triggered by a threshold in the preceding phase. Phase 1, Insulation. Accumulate capital. Establish offshore architecture. Capture regulatory frameworks. Build private legal infrastructure. This phase is complete in most advanced economies. It has been complete for decades. Phase 2, Separation. Begin the physical and jurisdictional disaggregation. Establish territorial prototypes. Develop autonomous logistical capacity. Pilot private governance models. Fund longevity and augmentation research. This phase is underway now. The prototypes exist. The research is funded. The territorial experiments are operational in multiple jurisdictions. Phase 3, Self-sufficiency. Complete the automation of essential functions. Food, water, energy, defense, governance, medicine, each brought within the closed loop of the enclave. This phase approaches completion in the most advanced enclaves within the coming generation. It does not require every system to be fully autonomous. It requires only that the enclave can sustain itself through disruption without recourse to external population or external governance. Phase 4, Closure. The perimeter closes. Not all at once, but progressively, in each domain, the connections between the enclave and the outside become one-directional or severed. Capital does not return. Talent does not leave. Governance no longer responds. The legal architecture fully insulates. The outside is no longer a source of input, it is merely a context that must be managed at the perimeter. Most analysts of elite behavior locate the problem in Phase 1, as if insulation were the crisis. The crisis is Phase 4. And Phase 4 does not begin. Phase 4 is the cumulative completion of decisions made in Phases 1, 2, and 3, decisions that, individually, in each phase, seem to have available correctives. By Phase 4, the correctives are gone. The exit strategy of power does not succeed because the powerful are ruthless. It succeeds because it is patient. Ruthlessness can be resisted. Patience can only be matched. And matching the patience of the powerful requires that the many sustain organized, coherent, strategically sophisticated collective action across the same time horizons that the powerful operate in, decades, not cycles. Democratic institutions are not designed for that. Social movements are not built for that duration. Human attention is not structured for that span. The exit strategy exploits not the weakness of will in the many, but the structural mismatch between the time horizons of those who are leaving and those who are being left behind. There is a phrase used in logistics, the last mile problem. It refers to the final segment of a delivery route, the hardest, most expensive, most unpredictable portion of the journey, the part where the organized efficiency of the system encounters the irreducible complexity of individual human lives. For the exit strategy of power, there is an inverse problem. The last mile of accountability. For most of modern history, the powerful could not fully exit because there was always a final dependency, a last mile of need, that kept them tethered to the governed. They needed the soldier's body. They needed the worker's hands. They needed the consumer's spending. They needed the voter's legitimacy. Each dependency was a thread. And threads, accumulated, form a rope. And ropes constrain even the powerful. The exit strategy is the systematic severing of threads. Not all at once. Not dramatically. One thread at a time, replaced by a machine, absorbed by an algorithm, outsourced to a system that does not vote, does not strike, does not demand, does not age, does not die, and has no claim on anything. When the last thread is cut, the rope falls. And the powerful, no longer tethered, rise. Not upward. Away. An exit is not a failure of vision. It is a completion of it. The strategy was always departure, the governance was always temporary, the social contract was always provisional, valid for exactly as long as the exit infrastructure was not yet built. When the last wall goes up, the last gate closes and the last system comes online, the contract is not broken. It is simply no longer needed. And what is no longer needed is no longer honored. This is not betrayal. The powerful will tell you this with complete sincerity. It is not betrayal. It is completion, and they will be by their own logic entirely correct. 4. From nations to compounds. The nation-state is an idea that required a specific set of conditions to become possible. It required a population that shared, or could be persuaded to share, a common identity robust enough to generate mutual obligation, the willingness to die for strangers, to pay for strangers, to constrain personal advantage for the collective continuity of strangers. It required a territory legible enough to govern, bounded, mappable, defensible, with resources sufficient to sustain the administrative apparatus that governance demands. It required a monopoly on legitimate violence within that territory, the Webbian condition, the foundational claim without which every other state function collapses into negotiation or coercion at the level of faction. And it required, most critically, a ruling class that could not exit. That last condition is the one no political theorist states plainly enough. The nation-state did not work because its rulers were virtuous. It worked because its rulers were stuck. Stuck in the same geography as the governed. Breathing the same air. Drinking from the same rivers. Vulnerable to the same plagues, the same droughts, the same invasions. Burying their children in the same ground. Shared vulnerability was the silent architecture of the social contract. The king who poisoned the river to punish the peasants also poisoned the river his own children swam in. The aristocrat who let the roads collapse to avoid taxation also traveled those roads. The industrialist who fouled the city with his factory also lived in the city. Not always adjacent. Not always equally exposed. But within the same system. Tethered, however asymmetrically, to the same fate. That tether, invisible, never codified, never acknowledged, was the rope that kept the powerful inside the bargain. Now someone has found scissors. The nation-state, as operative political form, is not disappearing. It is being hollowed. Its borders remain. Its flags remain. Its armies remain. Its bureaucracies remain, sprawling and expensive and increasingly purposeless. Its electoral rituals remain, producing governments that arrive with mandates and discover, upon arrival, that the actual levers of consequential decision have been quietly relocated to jurisdictions, institutions, and private architectures that electoral mandates cannot reach. The shell persists. The function migrates. This is the crucial distinction between the collapse of the nation-state, which is not happening, and the supersession of the nation-state, which is. Collapse would be visible. Collapse would generate crisis legible enough to mobilize response. Supersession is invisible by design. The institution remains. Its authority drains away through 10,000 legal structures, financial architectures, private governance frameworks, and territorial carve-outs, each individually defensible, each collectively amounting to the transfer of real power from accountable public governance to unaccountable private sovereignty. The nation is the facade. The compound is the operating reality. To understand the compound as political form, you must first understand it is not primarily a physical structure. It is a governance logic. A compound, in the emerging sense, is any system of organization that provides essential services, security, logistics, food, energy, medical care, dispute resolution, to those inside it. Extracts nothing from those outside it that it cannot also take by force or purchase on terms it dictates. Answers to no external authority it did not itself create or consent to. And has engineered, deliberately, the technical capacity to maintain all of the above without reference to the will, the needs, or the continued existence of any population outside its perimeter. By this definition, the compound does not require walls, though it will eventually build them. The walls come last. The governance logic comes first. The transition from nation to compound does not require the destruction of the nation. It requires only the duplication of the nation's essential functions within a parallel structure, and the progressive transfer of the governing class's actual dependence from the original to the copy. Consider the sequence carefully. The nation provides security. The compound builds private security, first as supplement, then as primary, with the national military reduced to perimeter management of the exterior, keeping the outside world's chaos from encroaching on the zone of insulated stability within. The nation provides law. The compound builds private arbitration, first for commercial disputes, then for governance questions, then for constitutional arrangements that insulate the compound's internal rules from democratic revision by external majorities. The nation provides infrastructure. The compound builds autonomous logistics, private energy grids, private water treatment, private satellite communications, private transportation networks, each decoupled, progressively, from the national systems they initially ran alongside. The nation provides medicine. The compound builds private health systems, initially framed as premium care for those who can afford it, eventually incorporating longevity research, genetic medicine, and augmentation technologies that are not merely better than public healthcare but categorically different in what they offer, not longer treatment but longer life, not management of decline but its reversal. The nation provides legitimacy. The compound builds algorithmic governance, rule sets encoded in systems rather than enacted through deliberation, decisions made by optimizing functions rather than representative processes, accountability rendered structurally impossible because there is no human decision maker to hold accountable, only the system, and the system is the architecture, and the architecture was designed by people who are no longer present for questioning. At each stage, the nation retains the name of the function. At each stage, the compound acquires the substance of it. The nation has a Ministry of Defense. The compound has a functioning army. The nation has a legal system. The compound has an enforcement mechanism. The nation has a healthcare system. The compound has longevity. The nation has democracy. The compound has continuity. There is a concept in ecology called competitive exclusion, the principle that two species competing for exactly the same niche in exactly the same environment cannot indefinitely coexist. One will outcompete the other. Not through violence, necessarily. Simply through more efficient conversion of available resources. The compound is not at war with the nation. It is simply more efficient at converting available resources, capital, talent, technology, legal architecture, into stable, self-sustaining governance. The nation requires consensus, deliberation, compromise, electoral cycles, bureaucratic friction, the management of diverse and conflicting interests across vast and heterogeneous populations. The compound requires none of this. It selects its population. It designs its rules. It optimizes its systems. It moves at the speed of executive decision rather than democratic deliberation. In the competition for the loyalty, the talent, and the investment of those with the resources to choose, the compound wins. Not by defeating the nation. By making the nation irrelevant to those whose choices determine outcomes. The geography of this transition is already visible to anyone willing to map it honestly. Certain cities within nations have, for decades, operated under governance arrangements that diverge significantly from the surrounding national context. Special economic zones in coastal China. Financial free zones in Dubai, in Singapore, in Luxembourg. Technology campuses in California that operate their own transit, their own security, their own social infrastructure, and lobby, successfully, for regulatory environments tailored to their operational needs. Gated residential communities in Sao Paulo, Johannesburg, Mexico City, each one a micro-compound, providing internally the security and services the surrounding nation cannot deliver to those outside its walls. These are not anomalies. They are prototypes. Each one a test of the same question: at what scale, with what technology, and under what governance arrangements can a compound achieve genuine self-sufficiency? The answer has been converging, across all these experiments, toward the same conclusion. Larger than previously thought. Faster than previously projected. And more politically achievable than democratic theory would predict, because the populations most affected by their emergence are precisely the populations with the least political leverage to stop them. The nation-state rested on a theory of territory, that sovereignty was inseparable from geography, that the power to govern a space derived from the capacity to control it physically, and that this control was itself dependent on the loyalty of the population within it. The compound inverts each element of this theory. It does not seek to control geography. It seeks to make geography irrelevant to its essential operations. A compound that can produce its own food, generate its own energy, manufacture its own goods, communicate via private satellite networks, and move its decision-making class between locations via private aviation is not a territorial entity in the traditional sense. It is a network of secured nodes, each node a physical location with its own perimeter and its own autonomous capacity, the network collectively constituting a sovereign entity that occupies multiple geographies while depending on none of them. The nation asks, what territory do you control? The compound asks, what dependencies have you eliminated? The nation measures sovereignty in square kilometers. The compound measures it in supply chain autonomy. What does a world organized around compounds rather than nations actually look like? Not chaotic. This is the important counterintuition. The transition from nations to compounds does not produce the collapse of order. It produces the privatization of order. Within the compound, extraordinary stability. Algorithmic governance optimized for the preferences of its inhabitants. Services of exceptional quality, delivered with frictionless efficiency. Security maintained by systems that do not tire, do not corrupt, and do not negotiate. Social environments curated for cognitive compatibility, the friction of genuine diversity eliminated through selection. Outside the compound, not chaos, precisely, but unmanaged complexity. The difference between chaos and unmanaged complexity is important. Chaos implies the absence of structure. Unmanaged complexity implies structure, of a kind, but without the organizing investment that converts structure into stability. Outside the compound, competing factions in resource-contested territories. Populations with political organization insufficient to leverage their numbers. Institutions with mandates but without resources. Technology widely distributed but without the infrastructure to make it productive. Intelligence widespread but without the coordination mechanisms to make it powerful. It is not the end of civilization outside the perimeter. It is civilization running on deferred maintenance, in permanent triage, with diminishing capacity to prioritize because prioritization itself requires the kind of surplus that has been steadily transferred, across decades, to the inside of the compound walls. The compound is, in the end, a solved problem surrounded by an unsolved one. This is its defining characteristic. This is what makes it not merely a governance form but a civilizational statement. The nation-state, at its best, was a collective project, the attempt to solve, together, the problems that no individual or faction could solve alone. Security. coordination, infrastructure, justice, the management of shared fate. The nation-state's foundational premise was, we are all in this together. Whether or not that premise was always honored, it organized political life. It gave grievance a legitimate address. It gave the governed a claim on the governing. It made the unsolved problems of the many the operational concern of the powerful. The compound rejects this premise. Not rhetorically, the compound's architects will invoke the language of contribution and responsibility and innovation with fluency and apparent sincerity. But structurally, the compound's foundational premise is, some problems are solvable. We have solved them. For us, the unsolved problems of the many are no longer the operational concern of those inside the perimeter. They are the external environment, to be monitored, to be managed at the margin, insofar as instability might reach the walls, but not to be solved. Because solving them would require the kind of investment, of capital, of technology, of governance capacity, that has been redirected into the compound. From nations to compounds is not a journey that ends. It is a divergence that, once passed beyond a certain point, becomes self-reinforcing and irreversible. The compound draws the most capable, the most resourced, the most technologically sophisticated operators from the national system. Their departure weakens the national system further. The weakened national system becomes less able to address the problems that make the compound attractive. The compound becomes more attractive. More capable actors choose the compound. The national system weakens further. Each cycle of the spiral makes the divergence larger. Each enlargement of the divergence makes reversal harder. Until the compound is not an alternative to the nation. It is the successor to it. And the nation is not a context within which the compound exists. It is a history the compound has moved beyond. The word compound comes from the Portuguese campão, a large open space, adapted through colonial contact to mean an enclosed settlement, a space within walls, separate from the surrounding territory and governed by its own rules. It was always a colonial word. Always described an enclosure maintained by those with the technology to build walls within territories belonging, in some prior sense, to others. The history was never innocent. The form was always about separation. The walls were always the point. Now the walls are smarter. And the technology is more complete. And the territory being separated from is not a distant colony but the majority of humanity. And the ones building the walls are not foreign powers arriving from elsewhere. They are already here. They have always been here. They simply no longer intend to stay. A nation is a promise made to everyone inside it. A compound is a promise made to everyone it select. The difference seems administrative. It is civilizational. The nation says, your birth here is your claim. The compound says, your value here is your entry. The nation inherits its population. The compound curates its own, and what is curated can be uncurated, and what is selected can be deselected. And what is admitted by value can be expelled by its absence. The nation had citizens, the compound has residence, and residency, unlike citizenship, has always been provisional. 5. The abandoned majority. Abandonment is not an event. It does not arrive with paperwork. It does not come announced by the institutions that are doing it. It does not present itself as what it is. It presents as budget constraints, structural adjustment, market realities, the unfortunate but necessary rationalization of unsustainable systems, the regrettable but unavoidable consequence of global competition, the painful but essential medicine of fiscal responsibility. The language is always medical. The language is always reluctant. The language always implies a temporary condition, a difficult passage toward a stability that is always, perpetually, just ahead. The stability never arrives. The passage never ends. And the language keeps coming, in every electoral cycle, from every party, with every variation of sincerity and cynicism available to human political performance. While the process underneath the language continues at its own pace, in its own direction, indifferent to what is said about it. Abandonment does not announce itself. It accumulates. Before the abandonment can be understood, the size of what is being abandoned must be held clearly. Not as abstraction. Not as statistic. As fact. The majority of humanity, the 99% in the reductive arithmetic of the doctrine, but more precisely, the 7, 8, 9 billion human beings who will not be selected for any enclave, who will not meet any compound's entry criteria, who will not be augmented or extended or algorithmically governed toward stability. This majority is not a peripheral concern. It is not a rounding error. It is not a manageable externality. It is the primary fact of human civilization, its accumulated labor, its cultural production, its biological continuity, its agricultural systems, its cities, its languages, its memories, its wars and its attempts to end wars, its diseases and its attempts to cure them, its entire record, across 10,000 years of organizing collective life under conditions of scarcity, conflict, and imperfect information. This is what is being left behind. Not a population. A civilization. And the ones leaving built everything they are taking with them from the surplus generated by that civilization's labor. The abandoned majority does not begin abandoned. It begins as the object of incomplete promises. The promises were real, in the sense that they were made with varying degrees of sincerity. Universal education. Universal healthcare. Universal access to the tools of economic participation. The gradual extension of the cognitive and material advantages once reserved for the few to the many. These promises were not only rhetorical. They were, in the 20th century, partially delivered. Literacy spread. Life expectancy rose. Infant mortality fell. Access to information expanded. The material floor of human life lifted, unevenly but measurably, across most of the globe. The promise seemed to be holding. The trajectory seemed to be pointing toward inclusion. And then the calculus changed. The changed calculus was not announced. But it can be precisely dated to the moment when the cost of continuing the promises began to compete directly with the cost of building the exit. The elite cannot infinitely fund both. The promises require redistribution. The exit requires accumulation. Redistribution and accumulation are not, in the abstract, incompatible. But at the scale and speed that the exit infrastructure requires, at the capital intensity of building genuinely self-sufficient enclaves, of funding longevity research, of deploying autonomous defense, of constructing private satellite networks and closed-loop agricultural systems. At that scale, every dollar that flows toward the promise is a dollar that does not flow toward the exit. And the exit has a deadline. The promises do not. The exit must be completed before the majority understands what is happening. The promises can be deferred forever with sufficient narrative management. So the promises are deferred. Indefinitely. Cyclically. With great rhetorical sorrow and precise operational indifference. What does it mean, materially, to be abandoned by the systems that once provisioned your life? Not all at once. In sequence. In accumulation. In the specific texture of daily life becoming progressively harder in ways that resist clean political articulation because no single degradation is dramatic enough to constitute a crisis and the accumulation of small degradations is experienced as personal failure before it is understood as systemic withdrawal. The hospital that is still open but whose wait times have tripled and whose equipment has not been replaced and whose staff are leaving for the private system at a rate that cannot be compensated by the hiring budget that has been cut for reasons that are explained in documents that use the word sustainability as if the unsustainability were a natural phenomenon and not a policy choice. The school that is still operating but whose curriculum has narrowed to what can be tested because what can be tested can be managed at scale and what can be managed at scale can be delivered cheaply and what can be delivered cheaply does not produce the kind of thinking that constitutes a threat to any arrangement that currently exists. The pension that is still nominally intact but has been adjusted, reformed, restructured, and recalculated enough times that the number it will eventually deliver bears no relationship to the number that was promised when the contributions were first extracted. The political party that still uses the language of representation but whose actual policy positions, when mapped against the interests of its donors against the interests of its voters, resolve cleanly and consistently in the same direction, every time, on every issue where those interests diverge. The democratic process that still occurs but whose outcomes, in the domains that matter most, capital mobility, corporate governance, monetary policy, trade architecture, are determined before the vote is counted by the architecture that the vote cannot reach. Each of these is not collapse. Each of these is the texture of abandonment. The abandoned majority does not know it is the abandoned majority. This is perhaps the most important structural feature of the abandonment and the one that makes it most difficult to interrupt. Because abandonment, to be politically actionable, must be named, located, attributed. The grievance must have an address. The harm must have an agent. The condition must be understood as chosen rather than inevitable. But abandonment at this scale is specifically designed to resist that attribution. The hospital's decline is the result of a budget decision made by a government responding to a bond market influenced by a ratings agency whose methodology was designed by economists trained in frameworks funded by foundations endowed by capital that has not lived in this city for 30 years. The chain of causation is real. Every link in it is traceable. But it is long enough, and technical enough, and distributed enough that by the time the person waiting 16 hours in an emergency room has followed it to its origin, the political moment that might have been mobilized by the direct experience of the harm has passed. The abandonment is legible in aggregate. It is illegible at the point of experience. And politics operates at the point of experience. There is a specific cruelty in the timing. The abandoned majority is being left behind at precisely the moment when the tools exist to make abandonment unnecessary. This is not the abandonment of an era of genuine scarcity, an era in which the resources to provision the many simply did not exist, in which the suffering of the majority was the tragic consequence of real material limitation. This is abandonment in an era of post-scarcity potential, an era in which the productive capacity of human civilization, augmented by automation and artificial intelligence, is sufficient to provision every human being on the planet with a material standard of life that would have appeared utopian to any prior generation. The food exists, or could exist. The medicine exists, or could exist. The housing capacity exists, or could exist. The educational tools exist. The clean energy transition is technologically available. The organizational capacity to distribute all of it is within the reach of the governance systems that currently exist. None of this is happening not because it is impossible but because the resources required to accomplish it are being redirected. Into the compounds. Into the longevity programs. Into the private satellite networks. Into the autonomous defense systems. Into the closed-loop agricultural installations inside the perimeters. Post-scarcity is real. But it is being delivered selectively. To those inside. The outside is not being abandoned because there is not enough. The outside is being abandoned because providing enough is no longer in the interest of those who control the enough. This is the specific moral character of this abandonment. It is not tragic. It is chosen. What remains, for the majority, when the systems of provision withdraw? Not nothing. This is important to understand because the temptation, in a document like this, is to describe the outside as pure negation, pure absence, pure deprivation, pure passivity. The outside is not passive. What remains is the majority's own intelligence, now augmented, in the compound's great miscalculation, by the same tools the enclave class deployed to justify its exit. The compound's architects distributed intelligence because they needed to extract value from cognitive labor before the exit infrastructure was complete. They monetized attention and automated insight and sold access to tools that, as a side effect of their commercial deployment, made the majority more capable of analyzing its own condition than any majority in human history. The majority outside the perimeter is not the peasantry of prior secessions. It can model. It can coordinate. It can simulate. It can understand, with tools now widely available, exactly what is happening to it, exactly which decisions, made where, by whom, produced the conditions it inhabits. The irony is structural and enormous. The compound gave the majority the tools of its own comprehension. Whether comprehension becomes power is the question the rest of this book is organized around. but the comprehension is real. And it is new. And the compound did not intend it as a gift. The geography of abandonment is not uniform. It has gradients. Concentric zones of increasing precarity radiating outward from the compound's perimeter. Immediately adjacent, the service class, those whose labor the compound still requires in physical proximity. Security staff at the outer margin. Agricultural technicians for the growing systems that are not yet fully automated. Construction workers for the perimeter expansions that are always ongoing. Medical support for the augmentation systems that still require human hands for some procedures. They live close to the wall. They earn enough to remain. They are not inside, but they are not fully abandoned, they are retained, which is a different condition, with its own specific psychology of proximity and exclusion. Further out, the former middle, those who once occupied the cognitive economy's middle distance, whose skills were valuable enough to build lives upon before automation removed the premium from those skills faster than new premiums appeared. This is the largest zone of abandonment and the most politically volatile, large enough to constitute a mass, educated enough to understand what happened to it, not desperate enough to have abandoned institutional channels entirely, but close. This is where the politics of the outside will be made. Or will fail to be made. Further still, the regions that were peripheral to the cognitive economy from the beginning, whose populations were always the surplus of the old industrial world, whose territories were always primarily extractive in their relationship to the center, who were promised inclusion and received connection without transformation. Digital access without infrastructure. Mobile phones without healthcare. Information without the material conditions to act on it. This zone is the largest, the least legible to the compound's models, and the most likely to generate the forms of organized pressure that don't resolve into negotiation because negotiation requires a counterparty and the compound has closed its doors. The abandoned majority will not starve uniformly. Some will find new forms of sufficiency in the interstices, the informal economies, the mutual aid networks, the distributed production systems that automation enables at small scale as well as at large. Some will be managed, kept stable enough to not constitute a security threat to the compound's perimeter, through the distribution of sufficient but minimal material provision, the automated welfare system that delivers enough to prevent the kind of organized desperation that might generate coordinated action. Some will organize, building, in the space the compound has vacated, new forms of collective governance adequate to the conditions of abandonment. Not restoration of the old nation-state. Something new. Something constructed from the tools at hand by people who understand, with unprecedented clarity, why the old forms failed them. And some will simply endure, the ancient human capacity for endurance that has always been the majority's most reliable resource and the powerful's most consistent underestimation. The abandoned majority is not a single thing. It is not a unified political subject. It does not have a single voice, a single interest, a single strategy. It is, by definition, everyone the compound did not select, which means it is almost everyone, which means it contains within it the full range of human possibility, brilliance and mediocrity, solidarity and predation, organizational genius and destructive fragmentation, the capacity to build new forms of civilization and the capacity to tear apart what remains of the old. The compound's great wager is that this heterogeneity is permanent, that the majority will never cohere into anything organized enough to constitute a threat to the perimeter. History suggests the wager is usually right. Majorities are hard to organize. Grievances are easy to redirect, to fragment, to absorb through partial concession. The tools of coordination are powerful, but so are the tools of disruption, and the compound has more of both. History also suggests the wager is sometimes catastrophically wrong. And the compound's architects know this. Which is why the walls are not symbolic. Which is why the defense systems are not theater. Which is why the perimeter is engineered to withstand not merely inconvenience but organized, sustained, technologically sophisticated pressure from outside. The compound does not trust its wager. It insures against its failure. That insurance is the wall. Here is what abandonment produces, over time, in any system that has experienced it. Not despair. Not immediately. Not uniformly. First, disorientation. The experience of a world that is not responding to what were understood to be its rules. Work harder and still fall behind. Vote and nothing changes. Follow the prescribed path and find the destination has been relocated. The rules were real. They have been changed. No one has announced the change. Then, attribution. The search for the cause of the disorientation. This is the most politically dangerous phase, not because attribution is wrong, but because it is hard, and in the difficulty, it can be captured. The compound is expert at redirecting attribution, toward the foreigner, toward the minority, toward the cultural enemy, toward the political opponent who is, structurally, in the same position as the person blaming them. Redirected attribution is the compound's most durable tool for managing the outside without engaging it. Then, adaptation. The majority begins to construct, from what is available, what the withdrawing systems no longer provide. Not restoration. Something new. Built from the tools at hand, the networks that survive, the organizational forms that the compound's own technology enables, and did not intend to enable, for those outside. Then, pressure. The adapted majority, with its distributed intelligence and its new organizational forms and its precise understanding of what happened to it and who built what and where the walls are and what is inside them, this majority begins to generate pressure on the perimeter. Whether that pressure produces re-entry, or negotiation, or something else entirely, something that neither the compound nor the doctrine of the 1% has yet adequately named, is the question that hangs over everything that follows. The abandoned majority is the largest fact in the world that the world's most powerful institutions are organized to avoid discussing directly. It is present in every development report as a problem to be solved. It is present in every humanitarian framework as a population to be assisted. It is present in every sustainability index as a risk to be managed. It is present in every security briefing as a threat to be contained. But it is never present, in any of these framings, as an agent. As a civilization. As the primary producer of everything the compound consumed on its way to self-sufficiency. As the entity with the most direct claim, moral, historical, productive, on the resources now behind the wall. The compound frames the majority as a problem. As a burden. As an externality. As terrain. The majority is none of these things. It is the world the compound was built from. It is the labor the compound accumulated. It is the civilization the compound is now leaving behind as though it were the remnant rather than the source. Part 1 ends here. In the space between the source and the remnant. In the distance between what was promised and what is being delivered. In the silence where the announcement of the abandonment was never made and will never be made because to announce it would be to admit it and to admit it would be to face what no enclave, however fortified, however algorithmically perfect, however biologically extended, has ever been able to face without consequence. The full weight of what it chose when it chose to leave. The majority has always known one thing the compound has not. It has known what it is to need, real need. Unmanaged need that cannot be optimized away or deferred to a later quarter. The compound has insulated itself from need so completely that it has forgotten what need produces in those who have no alternative but to feel it. Need, unaddressed, at sufficient scale, across sufficient time, does not produce despair. It produces imagination. A ferocious, lateral, ungovernable imagination about what else might be possible, what other arrangements, what other walls, what other doors, and where, in a wall that was built to last forever, the hinges are. Discussion about this episode. Comments. Restax. Recent episodes. The 1%, Part 6. 11 hours ago MXTM aka Pirate 1 VJ Sooner MIX.
Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. I've turned the fasten seatbelt sign back on because shit is about to get real.
Finish it!